Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm Ethan Worth, and this is episode number 60, where we ask, how do you get where you want to be?
And the worst piece of advice anybody could give a young person in their career, which is this idea behind following your passion.
And I was sort of sat there laughing, but also terrified inside that this is what I was stepping into.
The only reference point I had for this situation was probably from TV, from watching The Apprentice as a child.
Because what drives you, if you can get a handle of that, then I think you can make some decent decisions around what it is that you want to do and where it is that you want to be.
Welcome back into The Green Room. Our last episode was out and about at Twickenham Stadium with Baroness Karen Brady. So to be honest, it's quite nice to be back in our home studio. And this time out, we're looking at our journeys from a work point of view. So how do we get to where we want to be? Does where we start out mean we have to take different paths? What are those paths and what do we do when we actually get there? And to discuss this, I'm joined by the wonderful Annie Wong. How are you today, Annie?
I'm good. Adjusting to the cold weather, but doing okay. How are you?
Yeah, great. And as we're about to find out, we're joined by a Teach First star, and I also was a Teach First teacher. So
a Teach First star, Ethan.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I was on the star side of things, but yeah. And you're a school governor as well, aren't you?
I am a school governor, yeah, for a local secondary school of mine.
Great. So a topic close to our hearts.
So this week we're joined by Aziza Adak, who is a vice principal and science teacher at a school in London. She's also co-chair of Teach First Black Leaders Network and a trustee for Mission 44. We're also joined by Ben Newton, who joined Deloitte at the age of 18 and now at the age of 30 has become the first person to start as an apprentice on our Bright Start programme and make partner. Welcome, Aziza and Ben.
Thank you.
Before we start getting into the topic, to ease us in, we'll rewind all the way back to when you were younger, when you were children. And Aziza, I'll start with you. What did you want to be when you were younger and why?
This is a really easy question for me. I generally like a plan, so I had an idea. Everyone knew that this is what I wanted to do, and then that plan changed. But I wanted to be a doctor when I was younger, and I had a really close friend of mine. We lived about 2 minutes away from each other, and we both wanted to be doctors, so it was our dream to kind of do it together.
Nice. And Ben, what about you?
Unlike Aziza, my mind changed probably every 2 weeks. So many things I wanted to do. And the main one was being a footballer, as a lot of young children, I think, in the UK, playing for Southampton and England was my plan. And then that transition to being a historian, to being kind of a travel journalist is something I really want to do, like Simon Reeves, visiting new countries and reporting. But my mum always reminds me of a day at school. We had to dress up as what we wanted to be. And I think I dressed up in a suit and took a briefcase in and said I was going to be a business person. So maybe I wasn't too far wrong after all.
Manifesting.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that speaks to this idea that sometimes at school it feels like we have all these options open to us. So how did you both kind of decide where you wanted to land on, and were there people in your lives that you looked at for inspiration?
I actually think that there were sort of quite limited options when I was younger and in kind of primary school. I think there was a kind of your classic doctor, lawyer, teacher, the sorts of things that you see, and that was a very limited view of, I think, the careers that you can have. For me, it was a little bit to do with kind of proximity and where I was. I remember actually I lived on an estate on the other side of Hyde Park, and on the opposite side of Hyde Park was Imperial College London, and we used to walk through Hyde Park all the time, me and my friend, and we'd walk past Imperial College, and that was kind of like, we knew that Imperial College was a university that was focused on science, and therefore like we were going to be doctors and we were going to study at Imperial. There was something about our kind of locality that helped inspire what we wanted to do at the time. And then kind of as I grew older, I then actually decided I wanted to be a teacher, and then I changed my mind again when I went to university. But I think it was at university that I realised like the breadth of opportunity that was available. And my mind was sort of blown by that, I think, when I got to uni.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting, because if you grow up in an environment where perhaps your parents don't work in classic professions, you might not kind of know that there's this breadth out there. And if you then don't go to university, I guess that that doesn't always open up for you. So yeah, it's interesting that idea that there's all these options isn't always the case. How about you, Ben? How did you land on management consultancy? I mean, I didn't know that existed when I was
I don't think I wanted to grow up to be an accountant. But I think, I managed to do pretty well at school. and I was going to be the first person in my family to go to university. I had my place at Warwick to study maths, and I was speaking about maths just before the podcast. But I suppose over that summer where I was going to finish my A-levels, was going to go to university, I had a couple of jobs, and I actually started just looking online about what I might want to do after university. And that's where I came across kind of these school leaver schemes that existed and were in their infancy, really, and had the opportunity to come to London and have an interview at Deloitte, and then had a really difficult decision to make when I was 18 of, did I go to Warwick University and study maths for 4 years, or did I kind of start my career in the city? And to be honest with you, the school could give me a bit of advice, my parents could give me a bit of advice, but because nobody was from that background, it was pretty difficult to judge, and it was probably a uninformed decision joining Deloitte. But I suppose one that has worked out okay so far. But without that individual in your life that's probably been through that, it's quite difficult to get that advice and decide what you're doing is the right move or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And Aziza, you mentioned, feeling like some of your options were a bit limited. And Ben, you touched on maybe not necessarily having anyone that you could speak to about making that decision. And I think feeling like you have options is really important, but not everybody does. Mm. And I think it was Baroness Karen Brady who said last week that, everyone is born with ambition, which I think is true. But there's a quote that I love, which basically says, talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so if you feel like you don't necessarily have those options, I think it makes that decision even harder. And Aziza, I guess my question was, in your experience as a teacher and a vice principal, and maybe through your work with Mission 44, how has not having those kinds of options influenced those young people in how they make that decision?
I think it has a massive impact on both of those things. I think there is, unfortunately, probably a link between where a child goes to school and their kind of social mobility, their socioeconomic status, 10, 15 years down the line, because those opportunities that you get whilst you're at school, the interactions that you have with teachers or with employers, all have a kind of impact on the journey that a young person will make. And I think that in the most kind of challenging schools, that's where they don't get those kind of opportunities, I think, and they don't get those individuals who have maybe got the experience and the expertise to help kind of guide them through that. And it's probably one of the things, so I lead on sixth form, and it's probably the part of my role that I enjoy the most, because I've got these 16, 17, 18-year-olds just before they kind of leave the education system, and there is an opportunity to, we kind of do the A-levels and we do the academics, but there is an opportunity to help build their kind of character and their knowledge of the world that they're going into. And I find that a really kind of exciting and privileged part of my job to be able to do that with them. But I think the reality of the education system is that there's a lot of pressures on time, resources, which means that sometimes the work that is required around preparing children and young people to make good choices about their future isn't a priority, because that getting them great GCSEs and A-levels is a leveler. And so your priority is like, let's just provide them a really good academic education so that doors will be open to them. And that absolutely should be the priority, because if they don't have that, then they're even more limited. But then how do you provide all the other stuff that's really kind of important for them? And I think it's really hard for schools to do that.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned a point earlier about London and how just something about the nature of London means that you have kind of different social backgrounds and communities just jammed up against each other. And there's something really good about that you can have a kind of an investment bank in one place and then next door a school that's predominantly free school meals. Whereas other parts of the countries are often not like that. I believe, Ben, I think you're from Dorset, is that right? And I think the Southwest is often one of the most deprived areas of the UK. Yeah. Do you think regionally it's even more of a challenge, this idea of building aspirations and seeing where you can get to? Yeah,
I think definitely. If you look, actually, as a UK, we're pretty bad on social mobility kind of index compared to Western Europe averages, but London does okay. Yeah. And that's because of exactly that point, right? You've got different parts of London that are really close together. And growing up as a disadvantaged child in London, you can see that ambition and that opportunity. And potentially in some other cities in the UK, you don't get that. And coming to your point around proximity is really interesting, because actually, if you look at children from disadvantaged backgrounds, the biggest driver of their university choice is actually proximity. It's not looking at kind of top 10 league tables or the course. It's actually, am I close to my family? You might have caring responsibilities. You might not be able to afford the rent. And actually, when corporates are looking at who they're hiring, if you just limit it to those Russell Group universities, you're actually taking a big part of the talent pool out of that process. So I think that's a really important point there.
And speaking about university, you chose not to go to university in the traditional way. I know that you were linked to a university with your apprenticeship, and first apprentice to be made a partner. Congrats.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing achievement. Could you talk through a bit more about your decision to take that route, and if that's if you think that kind of non-traditional way into the professional workforce is something that's growing and more of an option these days?
Yeah, so I joined the firm in 2011, so the first cohort of this scheme, and lots of other financial institutions and law firms were doing this as well at the same time. And I suppose my decision not to go to university was probably driven by a few things. One was being a bit unsure, considering I was meant to be the first person in my family to go, unsure whether or not it was the right thing for me. I think secondly, whilst it probably shouldn't have, the debt scared me a little bit. I was drilled as a child that debt was bad. In reality, that's, I can now sit here as an adult knowing that's not necessarily true, but it's a little bit scary. And I think the scheme gave me the opportunity to get academic parity by getting the equivalent of a university course. It also gave me the ability to study, get some work experience straight away, and also earn some money. And those things combined, really gave me the opportunity to almost get a bit of a head start on my career. And to your point, we took 30 on our first year in 2011. I think this year we're taking on 350 in the UK. So it's really kind of grown. And actually, you're seeing a lot of companies now implementing these schemes or growing these schemes, because I think they appreciate that it's one way of tapping into a talent pool at quite an early age, but also a talent pool they haven't traditionally kind of managed to have in their environment. Maybe to give you an example of how significant that moment was, is I probably wasn't going to go to the interview at Deloitte at the time, mainly because the train ticket from my station to London Waterloo was about £100, and to 18-year-old me, that was a lot of money to invest in something that may or may not work out. The firm, I suppose, paid for expenses for people who were coming to have interviews, and actually that really small outlay in cost actually expands that network and that pool so much more vastly. And we've got the issue with kind of unpaid internships as well, and unadvertised internships. If you want to, you're a company, you want to do an unpaid internship, well, you're excluding a large portion of the population that can't afford to go a year unpaid. I've met loads of people, especially in advertising and more creative industries, that need to do 1 year, 18 months just unpaid. And that really does segregate the population. Yeah. And potentially even worse than that is unadvertised internships, because those exclude people that don't have the professional connections in the industry. And I think the quicker firms get rid of those things, the much wider that kind of that social kind of diversity network is going to be within their companies.
Thinking back to your first day or first few weeks at work, how was that like for you guys? I mean, for me, I probably first did a job when I was 16, but in terms of professional work, it was a bit of a different experience. So how did that kind of those that reality measure up to those kind of expectations?
I finished my degree. At the time I'd finished my degree, I decided that I didn't want to be a teacher, and I was going to go into research, and I was going to do a PhD. So I went and did a master's, and then I sort of took a year out as a research assistant. And it was in that year that I decided, actually, I really do want to become a teacher, and that's all I've ever wanted to do. So I applied for Teach First, and at the time, I think I'd had my offer actually at this point when the BBC documentary aired, and I was watching this BBC documentary, Tough Young Teachers, with my family. And it was a kind of awkward watch, knowing that I was going into it and that I was going to be teaching science, and there was someone on there who was a science teacher, and we were sort of watching it, and everyone in my family found it hilarious, and I was sort of sat there laughing but also terrified inside that this is what I was stepping into. So I had kind of an expectation in my mind based on what I'd seen on TV about what it was going to be like. Was it like the TV show? Probably like that. I think it was hard. It was hard. It was really, really hard. Yeah. It was really, really hard. I was in a school. I had no idea what I was doing. Got 30 students looking at you. I was teaching sciences, obviously the practical element to contend with. like I was scared of the Bunsen burners. Like we didn't do practicals for about 6 months.
Of course,
and the kids sort of knew that I was kind of new in and this is why I wasn't doing it. And I think I cried on my head of department in the first week and it was just really awkward. And anyway, so yeah, it was tough.
Yeah, I'm getting some flashbacks, I think.
Yeah.
Well, how about you, Ben?
I found it okay, actually. I think what really helped me is that there was a cohort of 30 of us that were all in the same boat, really. And I ended up living with 3 of them eventually. We all had a flat in East London. And yeah, it felt like you could go home and talk to people about your experiences and what you've been doing. And they'll give you some informal, maybe not appropriate advice sometimes. I just remember how different London was to where I grew up. I remember one day trying to get some lunch and I didn't make my own lunch for a day. So I went to somewhere that had Sainsbury's on the building. So I thought I'll go in there. Walked up to the front desk and asked where everything was. And it was the head office of Sainsbury's. It wasn't the Sainsbury's supermarket. And I suppose that always sticks with me because the head office is just around the corner, isn't it? And it always sticks with me as kind of, this kid from Dorset growing up and now working in London, getting things wrong. But I think just, I wasn't potentially used to the busyness, wasn't used to the diversity in London. Growing up from a small town in Dorset, in a very a place where diversity isn't that strong. It was a bit of a culture shock, but it was really fortunate to have those individuals there that were around me to be able to talk to on a day-to-day basis.
And you speak about kind of having that cohort and that camaraderie, which I think you get with Teach First as well. What other kind of things can employers do to help early starters at that stage of their career?
I think what I really liked about Teach First, and I think they do really well, is that recruitment based on alignment to a kind of mission and a vision. And I think that unites people because you are around people who kind of believe the same thing and want the same thing. And you can keep revisiting that when the going gets tough. So I think having a really clear kind of vision and mission that people are then bought into, and using alignment to that as a kind of recruitment measure, I think is great. And then building opportunity for people to like come together and be with one another when, as they're kind of progressing. And I think there was lots of events that were really valuable for me in those kind of early weeks, but also meeting other people who were 2-3 years ahead who I could see as well, they're successful, they've been through it, they've got similar stories to the stories that I have experienced similar things and they've been successful at it. So it is possible. I think definitely helped me.
Great.
Yeah, I think from my experience, I was the first kind of cohort of students that went into to not having a degree straight into Deloitte. And I suppose there wasn't anybody who had gone through our scheme, which was a little bit daunting at the time. But I think, you get those people in your career and in your life that understand that and understand the challenges and I suppose put that extra effort and that extra investment in you, recognizing the fact that your pathway is a little bit different to others. And, I've been really fortunate in my career to have some really senior people who have, I suppose, probably consciously or unconsciously identified that I've not gone to university and have a bit of a different perspective and have actually changed things a little bit to help me through that. So I think having that investment from senior people it's been really important in my career so far.
On that point around community building, the events that you mentioned, Aziza, networking in general, networking is something that I really struggle with. I don't enjoy it. I find it really hard. And I think a lot of people do find it quite uncomfortable. And I actually think that where you don't have the same background as a lot of your peers is even more uncomfortable. So whether it's not having gone to university or being, significantly younger or being black or whatever it might be, I think that can cause a real barrier to successful networking. I guess, Aziza, in your experience, what would you say are some of the things that have worked really well in breaking down those barriers for certain groups?
I think we have to talk about it and talk about the reality of networking. I think often we talk about networking being a good thing, but you don't often hear people talk about how difficult it is, and actually just being really real and honest about the fact that it is hard for many people. I think that's one step in helping that process. But I think the earlier we talk about it and the earlier we get young people to do it, the better. So, I talk to my students about setting up a LinkedIn account when they're 16 and to going out to events and meeting people. I talk to them about how awkward it is. I talk to them about the network that I've managed to establish and the opportunities that has afforded me. But I also talk to them about how hard I found it myself and how whilst it's much easier for me now, it wasn't when I was much younger. So I think being honest about it and then deliberately practicing and training students and young people on it, I think is going to be really, really important. And for me, I went to Durham University, which is still till today the university with the highest proportion of students from private schools. And that's something I found really, really hard. And I was actually really annoyed at my school for not preparing me for that. I had a sense of, you got me the A-levels, but you didn't teach me how to navigate being in this environment. And I sort of had to learn it the hard way. Whereas it could have been more easier for me if someone had spoken to me about it and then helped me practice it before I got into those scenarios and situations.
Did you know, at Deloitte, we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme, like Loaf Catering, part of Now Group in Northern Ireland. They support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter, just like the ones we have here on the green room table. Now, back to our topic of the day.
I read a really interesting thing in the research to this episode that was people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, when they get into the workforce, are 25% less likely to be promoted. And it probably links with the networking point. But I guess there's one thing around getting people through the door, but then there's also something about when you're through the door, what can firms do to make sure that there is equal opportunity within the world of work, as well as getting into it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's difficult, and I suppose we've all seen the reports that have been out there for years now talking about how diverse teams lead to better outcomes, economically, and that's through better customer outcomes, it's through happier teams, better productivity. And, if we think about ethnicity and we think about gender, whilst there's still so much further to go on those issues, actually they're monitored and reported on now quite frequently in businesses. And actually, kind of social economic diversity is much harder because it cuts through a lot of these issues. And if we think about why that is, there's a few things. One is, well, which data point do you use to measure? Businesses really change when they can monitor and measure things. Do you use kind of postcode? Do you use free school meals? Do you use the occupation of your main caregiver at the age of 14, which I think a lot of companies use? But that difference makes it really challenging. And then the data isn't binary. It's not you're privileged or not privileged. It is you're on a scale of somewhere between disadvantaged and wealthy, and where you're on that scale will depends. Will have a big impact on your career. And then finally, is the information isn't out there. You've got to give that up yourself. It's not like ethnicity or gender. It's a metric where you've got to give consent. And actually one of the things we're finding quite hard at the firm at the moment is getting people to give that information, either just through people giving it or people not wanting to give it. And all of those three things, I think, whilst companies might want to do their best when it comes to social mobility, actually if they can't have the data points to monitor and measure that, it becomes really difficult. I don't know what you think, Aziza.
Yeah, I'd say, I agree. And I think one added complexity is probably intersectionality, and the fact that individuals will hit various different aspects of that, whether it's ethnicity or gender or whatever it might be, and that just makes it even more complex. But ultimately, this is about people and development on a simple level. And I think if an organisation can do a fair and equitable job of their processes of development, managing people, and recruitment, then that's kind of half of the battle. And I think that focusing on that is probably more tangible and easier for organizations to kind of get their hands on. And then once you've got that into a place where you can be really confident that those processes are really fair, really developmental, then you can start getting a little bit more granular and looking at other elements around social mobility and, social class and ethnicity and gender, etc. But I would say that there's probably a lot of organizations who think that they're in a good position on managing people and developing people, and they're probably not. And actually, if we can have a really honest conversation about what that should look like with the kind of research and the data there, then I think that we might be able to start making a bit more headway in that direction. But it is really hard, and I think I don't think there's any aspect of society or any kind of workplace or big organisations who've really kind of managed to get under the skin and tackle the issue. And it's even in education, which, is designed to be a lever for social mobility, there is lots of issues around kind of progression and development. And that's you know, that's where you've got people sat around the table who all kind of believe in the power of social mobility and all these things, and yet we still struggle with that a lot.
There's a big economic benefit here. You know, there's so many ethical reasons of why social mobility is important. But you know, thinking about the economy, you know, the more efficient an economy is of matching kind of roles and careers to people with the biggest potential to fulfill those, the best the economic output. And that really means that low social mobility really does oppress employment, but also productivity. And, you know, we're getting to a situation, I think, where it's really important for companies to think about that and think about the economic impact as well as the ethical impact, because, you know, as I mentioned previously, in the UK, we're quite far down on statistics. And if we just move to the European average, I think, of social mobility, you know, I read a study the other day in preparation for this, it's a 9% kind of benefit to the economy by better matching those people to those roles. And, you know, if you're from a disadvantaged background, you might not necessarily have the opportunity to fulfill those roles that you have the potential to fulfill. So yeah, there's so many ethical arguments, but it just makes good business sense as well.
Bringing us back to our question of the day, which is, how do you get to where you want to be? So you start work, you get into your role. I think it's quite easy to get focused on the grind and the day to day and not necessarily give yourself time to stop and reflect on, you know, the achievements that you've made, the direction that you're going in, and how you can reflect on your motivations and what the right next step might be for you. Ben, I'll come to you first. What are some things that you have done to enable you to do that and build that into your busy day?
I get quite a few of these questions from team members when I'm discussing with them around kind of career and what they'd like to do. And I suppose there's always two things I try and mention. And the first is probably the worst piece of advice anybody could give a young person in their career, which is this idea behind following your passion. You know, usually this is said by somebody who's very financially secure, or the 0.01% of people that have followed their passion and are making a huge success of it. That's my genuine belief, because, you know, if I think about what individuals should be doing, they should be finding what they're good at. You know, that's really important, and then dedicating the hours, the grind, the grit, the determination, resilience, overcoming the tough things to be great at something. Because once you're great at something, actually it's that greatness that makes you passionate about the underlying thing. It's the financial reward that comes with that. It's the sense of self-worth. It's the camaraderie. There's so many things about being great at something, which I think makes you passionate about the subject. Nobody grows up wanting to be an accountant, you know, but it's being great at, but it's being great at accounting, which I think makes people passionate about it. And that's I think the worst advice you can give somebody is to follow your passion, because for the vast majority of people, it doesn't work. The second thing I try and tell people is, somebody will come up to me and say, Ben, I'd like to be a partner at Deloitte, or Ben, I'd like to be a CFO. And the first question I go for is why? And it's such a simple question, but it's so difficult for some people to answer. And that's because they're focused on the status or the occupation or the title, rather than what I try and describe as the feeling that comes with. And I think if we're able to pivot that view between the feeling, that gives you a much broader selection of roles, but it also is much more purposeful. You know, if you want the role to have flexibility, if you want it to have something that really challenges you kind of mentally, if you want it to have a role where you're looking after lots of people, you might just want to work on your own. But actually, if people start to think about the feelings that they're having rather than, oh, I want to be an X, I think people are going to probably be a lot happier. And actually, when the difficult times come, which they will, it's a lot easier to be resilient when you've got that purpose and that why behind you.
What do you think, Aziza? Do you agree? Do you think there are more young people that
100% agree?
Don't follow your passion,
I definitely, I agree, because I also think passions change. You know, if I think about what I was passionate about at 11 years old and then at 15, like it changes, right? You're exposed to different things, you have different experiences. To a certain extent, you don't really like have an idea of like what you're good at until you put your hand to it, and then you've got a sense of whether that comes more naturally, whether you have to kind of work hard at it. So I definitely kind of agree with that point. If I think about my kind of career and my journey, I was definitely driven by the title and the status and the money. But there was a strand of that was like, oh, I want to do something that has purpose. So, you know, when I was thinking about being a doctor, it wasn't just being a doctor, it was being like a consultant at the top of my field. Or when it was, you know, I want to be a teacher, it was like, no, I want to be a head teacher, I want to be at the top of my field. And I was always kind of driven by that. And I think that as I've gotten older and I've spent more time reflecting on my journey, ultimately I could have done and become anything, but I was driven by wanting to be socially mobile. And obviously at the time I didn't realize that that's what it was. But I didn't want to be in a situation that was similar to my mother's situation. I didn't want to be, I wanted to own my own house. I wanted to have a family, to be financially free and all those things. And actually I wanted to be happy. Like that's what I wanted. I wouldn't have articulated it that way, kind of being much younger. I sort of pigeonholed it into a role and a responsibility and a job. But ultimately, I think you need to think about what drives you, because what drives you, if you can get a handle of that, then I think you can make some decent decisions around what it is that you want to do and where it is that you want to be.
It sounds like almost kind of, in corporate world these days, right? A purpose is such a big thing, but actually people need to invest time in themselves to think about their own purpose. I think that's really important, because to your point, if you're thinking, my purpose is to become a head teacher, or my purpose is to become a partner at a law firm or a accountancy firm. Well, actually, once you get there, then what's next? You have to meet so many people who actually, once they've had that pinnacle and they've met that stage, they're actually quite deflated afterwards. And actually having that drive and understanding yourself, and that gives longevity and infinity rather than something that is kind of finite. So.
But also if you don't get there, right? If you don't achieve that or certain things happen in your life, like I think, the impact on your mental health and your well-being can be so stark if that's, you've been so laser focused on, achieving that X or that Y.
Is that idea that career progression or that career attainment is more important than career fulfillment? And I don't think it is, because to your point, Ben, okay, you get there and that's great, but do you even take the time to celebrate before you move on to the next goal? And also the journey and everything you've learned and all the relationships that you've built, that's a huge part of success as well. And Ben, you mentioned people now come to you and ask you, I want to do this, I want to do that, and you're able to pay it forward to them. Do you feel like that's a big part of your vision of where you want to be and your view of success, is that ability to be able to pay it forward and create that success for other people as well? Yeah,
definitely. And as you were saying about wanting to be happy, right? I think that's a really important part of your career as well, and how you mold your career around things that you love and being happy. And I suppose when I have these conversations with people kind of across the firm around their future and their career, I think it's important to understand that it's not a race, and they're enjoying the journey. Is we're talking about kind of getting to that stage, right? Enjoying the journey is just as exciting, even more exciting than the destination. And I think sometimes, especially in the world that we live in now, where everything's instant, there is a lot of value in enjoying working towards something, and something doesn't have to happen instantly. As long as you feel like you're growing and you're working towards your purpose that we discussed, it doesn't really matter the status of that, because that will come in time. And I think it's about finding those mentors, either inside work or outside of work, that can help you along that way. Because I agree, in my first few years of my career, I was definitely like, okay, I need to get to this level, then I need to get to this level and this level. It was very kind of goal orientated, which causes some real challenges, I think, for the long term.
So you've both spoken a lot about mentorships and how it's important to kind of actively seek those out. But what about businesses and employees? What role do they have in order to kind of provide those mentorships, but also other things that they might be able to do to ensure that people are getting the most out of their careers?
I think having, if you say to business leaders, go and mentor some people, it's likely to attract those people that are extroverts and really love that part of their job in a senior position, to also those that are extroverts and are looking for that mentorship in junior positions. And what it's not doing is probably matching the people that really need it the most. So I think having some structure around that is really important. But just as important as the structure, I think, is the time, because it shouldn't really be a side of desk activity. And, we're all busy with, client work or other work, but actually making sure that companies are carving out time for people as part of development for that mentorship is really important. And feeding back as well. It can't just be, I'm your mentor for a year and that's it. This should be a continued relationship. And there should be a feedback loop as well to understand where mentorship's going well and what the positive results, and where it's not going so well, let's make some adjustments. So I think the onus really is on corporate entities there to make a real go of it. I
have two examples to speak of that I think that I've seen in two different organisations. So the first was with Teach First. So when I was on the board of trustees for Teach First, they introduced a mentoring circle, which was kind of a different way to do mentoring, where a trustee had a kind of group of employees within Teach First that they were kind of mentoring in a kind of group scenario. And I think what that provides is sometimes multiple role models, because you're kind of around different people from different aspects of the business, maybe people that you've kind of never interacted with before, but then you've got this relationship with this kind of external person who doesn't work in the organization, but has maybe got all sorts of kind of experiences that they can kind of speak to. And the kind of brief on that was really kind of open-ended, and it was something that I kind of really enjoyed kind of doing with Teach First employees. And there was that process of kind of feedback and kind of iterating it for further development. And then the second one was in my current school as part of United Learning, which is one of the largest trusts in the country. And they introduced a reverse mentoring program. So it was where kind of senior people in the organization were mentored by kind of more junior colleagues. I was on that. I did that program for a year. Basically working with someone who's really, really senior in the trust and sharing lots of kind of my experiences, but also kind of learning from that individual. And we would talk about certain projects that we were working on individually and kind of ask advice of each other. And I think that was just almost flipping mentoring on its head, but was useful for me, and I think also useful for that individual that I was mentoring.
Ben, I know you're the first Bright Start to become a partner, so you didn't necessarily have a role model who'd done it before. Do you think you would have benefited from that, or do you think that you were able to find role models in other ways who maybe didn't necessarily follow the same path, but were role models in a different way?
I think I would definitely have benefited from somebody who had gone through the scheme before me and seeing them as a role model. I think in any part of society, seeing somebody succeed in a similar position as you is really important around representation. But I suppose I was really fortunate to have some really senior partners who were my role models and still are today, and actually not just role models in how they act, but also are able to make slight adjustments to my career to benefit me and support me, recognizing that different path that I took through the firm. And one of the things that really sticks in my mind was pretty early in my career, I had a promotion panel, which I hadn't experienced before, which was myself, sitting with 4 really senior partners across the table from me. And the only reference point I had for this situation was probably from TV, from watching The Apprentice as a child. None of my parents had been through this situation before, and I didn't have anyone really to talk to about it. And it meant that I probably went into that meeting quite combative, and also quite passionate, and maybe over passionate. I remember the partner ringing me the next day and just said, "Oh, how did the meeting go?" And I kind of said, "Yeah, thought it went okay, a few tough questions, but I think I did all right, trying to play it cool." And I remember him telling me it was awful. And my heart kind of sank, and I was like, oh, this is going to be really difficult to deal with. And I remember him saying, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And he said, "I've got you another chance at the panel." And that really sits in my mind a lot. And I think it's, that person recognizing that I probably hadn't been through that situation before, and making that slight adjustment to give me another opportunity. And I think as role models, that's the best thing you can do. It's fine sitting, having a conversation, but how you're actually able to champion that person and make adjustments to make their path not easier, but make those adjustments to get them to fulfill their potential is really valuable, I think, in the workplace.
Aziza, I'd love to hear more about Mission 44 and maybe some examples of where you've seen organisations do a really good job of supporting people when they're making their career decisions.
Yeah, so I've recently joined the board of Mission 44. I think what attracted me to the organisation was their kind of approach to what they do. I think trying to tackle issues around social mobility and underserved groups and ethnicity is really quite complex, and there's lots of organisations that are doing incredible things in those spaces, particularly around kind of young people. But what Mission 44 is trying to do is amplify the work of certain organisations, and some organisations that people wouldn't even know about, and in doing so kind of invest in them and then draw those things together and advocate on the whole. And I think that to me felt like a different approach to be taking to some of the issues that we've talked about in this episode. So that's kind of what attracted me to their work. And as a result, they're doing all sorts of things with different partners. I think they're doing some work around kind of exclusions, for example, and trying to look at certain groups that seem to be disproportionately affected by permanent exclusions in schools. And what they're doing is just partnering with, academy trusts that are working in those areas and saying, actually, we see the work that you're doing. like, here's some support, here's some funding to help you either kind of accelerate that process or to get to an outcome that's even better than it would have been without our kind of support, and then hopefully amplify that work. So I think that's really exciting. But they're also doing some work with Teach First around increasing the number of Black kind of STEM teachers, which is a particular issue in the profession at the moment. So they've done some kind of recruitment work around trying to increase the number of Black people from those backgrounds going into teaching via the Teach First route. And they're actually doing some work. They're kind of supporting some of our work around increasing the number of Black head teachers as well. And obviously that's, really, I think, significant in trying to increase the number of role models from diverse backgrounds in education.
And I think we're coming towards the end of our episode. We like to end with a bit of advice, as well as the big question, which we'll come to in a minute. But in terms of advice, what advice would you give to young people? I mean, I think you've given loads of advice already, but just to sum up, what kind of advice would you give to young people who are starting out their career journey?
I'd say network. I think it's hard, but it will absolutely pay dividends throughout your career, and you'd be surprised the people that you kind of meet early on, and then 5-6 years down the line pop up again and play some significant part in the next step that you take or whatever it might be. So that'd be my number one tip.
Nice. How about you, Ben?
I think mine would be to identify those people who are going to be championing you. I think that's really important. And whether you're in the workforce or outside the workforce, I think, since your point around networking, but I think I'd really focus on those kind of 3 or 4 people that are going to support you, because, if you come from a background of being disadvantaged or from an ethnic minority or potentially underrepresented kind of part of the workforce, actually it's those people that are really going to support you and drive you forward, and really stay close to them and learn from them, because it's a long career and you don't need to know all the answers straight away. So I think staying close to them from a business perspective and from a learning perspective, but also to champion you and mentor you would be my key piece of advice.
Amazing.
Great advice. Thank you both so much. Final question to wrap us up in one sentence, which I know is quite difficult. But to answer our big question of the episode is, how do you get to where you want to be?
Find out where you want to be first, by focusing on your own purpose and feelings rather than status, and invest time in yourself.
Nice. And one
Good
sentence.
luck following that one.
That's why I went first.
Exactly what I would have said. I would say, invest time in yourself, getting to know yourself. Find other people around you who will help you on that journey. And just work hard.
Nice. Good way to end it. Perfect. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's really great to hear from you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth, and Annie Wong. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett.